Hi, so today I thought I'd talk about books that were adapted into Oscar-winning films. Now, obviously, books are a great source of material for film, and there's tons of films that I could be talking about, but today I'm just going to be talking about 4. First up is one of my favorites. It's called Gentleman's Agreement, and it stars Gregory Peck. This is a movie that is about a white Christian man who is assigned a piece on anti-Semitism in America. And he decides to go undercover and pretend that he is actually Jewish. And for 6 months, he just introduces himself as a Jewish person, and he takes on another name, and he writes about all the little pieces of racism that he encounters. What I particularly like about Gentleman's Agreement, apart from Peck himself, whom I enjoy in pretty much everything, is that it doesn't shy away from doing things that we still talk about today in 2020. For example, it talks about how racism isn't something that is happening to other people or it's being committed by other people. Sometimes it's happening in our own families, or it's being committed by people whom we love, and we want them to do better because those are the people that we can really influence. I don't want to give too much away of the story because I think it's sadly very relatable in 2020 and everyone should watch it, because it really talks about how something like anti-Semitism is so ingrained at the minutest of societal levels. It is also an interesting film, historically speaking, because it was made by Darryl Zanuck, who is not Jewish but was a huge media mogul. And think like, Sam Goldwyn, for example, of MGM. But he had, a slightly ethnic sounding name, and he worked in Hollywood, which was really populated by a lot of Jewish people. And so at one point he tried to apply to the Los Angeles Country Club, and they wouldn't have him. They blackballed him because they thought he was Jewish. And that's what made him decide to make this movie, because he thought that the current of anti-Semitism in America and in American society at the time, pretty much right now too, needed better exploration. So he conceived of this film, and he first offered it to Cary Grant, who passed, and then Gregory Peck took it on because he's a real mensch. But when Zanuck came up with this idea and people began to hear about the project, a bunch of actual Jewish people who worked in Hollywood, including Sam Goldwyn, went up to him and asked him not to make the film because they said it would stir up trouble. I mean, I want you to take a moment to just think about it. Sam Goldwyn, who basically owned all of Hollywood, but even he didn't want to borrow any trouble, because when it comes to trouble, the Jewish people know all about it. Zanuck went ahead anyway, and funnily enough, it did lead to trouble. Really bad trouble. So this was a time when the House Committee for Un-American Activities was being convened. If you don't know what that is, then you should Google, because it's a dark chapter in American popular culture, and I think we should really pay attention to it because so many parts of the world are sort of sinking into the same kind of political condition that gave birth to that particular committee. So the director of this movie was Elia Kazan, who is sort of infamous for not just being hugely talented, but also for naming names, by which I mean that he pointed out his fellow workers, artists, writers in Hollywood who were ostensibly part of the Communist Party. Now, one of the actors in the film was John Garfield, who actually was Jewish, but he, like a lot of other Jewish people working in America at the time, had adopted a more, Gentile-sounding name just so that he could pass and get work. And he was called before the committee, and he refused to name names, but then he was blacklisted in Hollywood. About 1 year later, they called him again to testify, and before he could go in front of the committee, and he probably wouldn't have named any names then either, But he died of a heart attack at age 39, and we can only guess that, it was the stress that did him in. So yeah, there's a lot of history attached to this movie, and I haven't seen it in a few years, but I would imagine it still holds up. And even if the movie doesn't hold up, I think the themes will. I haven't read the book, but it was a bestseller at the time, which is why it was made into the movie, in addition to Zanuck's personal experiences. Next up is the Bridge on the River Kwai, which is based on a fictional story written by a French writer, but based on true events. Now, if you know anything about Japanese prisoners of war or the POW camps, then you know that those were like really bad places. The human rights abuses carried out in those camps are legendary. The Bridge on the River Kwai is about one such camp, but it's also about the war. It's not just about the camp. So basically there is a bridge over the River Kwai in Thailand. And this bridge is of great military importance because it's an essential part of the supply line for the Japanese forces. And the Japanese are using their prisoners of war, mostly British and American soldiers, as menial labor. Conditions are harsh, and the soldiers know that they need to stop or sabotage the bridge in some way, because if that bridge is completed and the Japanese continue the supply uninterrupted, then it's going to be very bad for the Allies. It's one of the most famous war movies, and I highly recommend it if that's a genre that you if you like, or if you just like to try something in that genre. So on a tangent, I lived in Thailand for many years, and I ended up teaching English. And a bunch of my students, my learners, were Japanese and Japanese businessmen. So when you're teaching English, you do these things where you're like, well, describe your weekend. Like, what did you do this weekend? I did such and such. What did you do? And then they would just try and speak to you about it just to practice their conversation. So one Monday or Tuesday, I asked one of my learners what he did that weekend, and he said he and his family had gone on a picnic to a fun historical tourist site that was very famous for Japanese people. And I said, well, where is that? Because, because there's a lot of Japanese people in Thailand, and they kind of talk about Bangkok being Tokyo's 51st district, because Tokyo has 50 districts, see? So I wanted to know where this place of historic importance to the Japanese was, and he said it was a historic bridge. And I was so confused because I was like, wait, what? A bridge? And for some reason, I didn't quite realize that Kwai was in Thailand. I just, I knew it was somewhere in Southeast Asia, but I had never put two and two together. And then eventually I understood what he was saying, and there was a very awkward silence because that movie is not complimentary to the Japanese. So I don't really understand why the Japanese would consider that to be a dear historical picnic place, unless I missed something in translation. If you're Japanese and you know something about it, please do let me know. I am very interested. Next up is Gigi by Colette. Now, Colette is an incredibly interesting character. She has been called, at one time she was called the greatest French writer living. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize. But she's also a somewhat divisive figure, not in France so much, but outside of France, because during the Second World War, she was seen by many to be a Nazi war collaborator because she wrote for Nazi newspapers. I should point out that at the time she was married to a Jewish man who had been taken away by the Nazis, and she was terrified for him. So there's a lot of nuance that you can read into the situation. It really depends. The Gigi that she wrote was a novella, and then it was adapted for stage, and then by Vincent Minnelli for film. I don't know if you've ever watched a Vincent Minnelli musical, but those are extravaganzas. Like, if you imagine the old school Hollywood musical, what you're imagining is probably a Vincent Minnelli film. And Gigi is charming. You know, it's Leslie Caron at the height of her being Leslie Caron. And Louis Jourdan, who is incredibly handsome, and Maurice Chevalier, who is incredibly charming. And the music is great, the set design and the costumes. Oh my god, the costumes. There is so much to love about that film, but once you take away the trappings and you really think about the story, it is incredibly disturbing. It is essentially a story about child prostitution because Gigi is 16, which I guess is sort of, if you're one of those people who are like, well, 16, that's the age of consent, then sure, but I think of a 16-year-old as a child. I think the justification is that being a courtesan, especially in that era in France, is a very different thing than how we think of prostitution today. But it's still pretty yucky. I mean, she's a schoolgirl, and then all of a sudden her grandmother and her great aunt are basically shaming her for not wanting to become the mistress of a man that she's known her entire life. And he gets really mad too that she doesn't immediately want to become his mistress. It's all very French. French people get very mad when I say that, and they're just like, well, it's not really true. But I'm sorry, French people. You know I love you, but it's true. The novella, I thought, was considerably less charming than the film because it doesn't have those trappings of glamour and beauty. So the subtext is a little bit more clear, but it is a good story, and I do like Colette's writing. So I would recommend that you check it out. The last book I want to talk about today is Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. I love this film and I love the book. I actually read the book before I saw the film, and I was so excited to find out that there was a film version. If you haven't read Around the World in 80 Days, or because you thought that, you know, well, it's such an old book, like how good can it be? It is an amazing book. Like Jules Verne, he basically invented the genre, you know. The novel is truly the finest example of post-industrial colonial 19th century that you can find. It talks about some of the greatest technological innovations that we can find in the Victorian era. So you have the Transcontinental Railway in the United States. There is the Suez Canal in Egypt. And there's the linking of the railways in India. Each of these things changed the world forever. You have to understand, like, before these things came about in a period of basically 2 years, I think like 1869, 1870. Before that, people, you know, it took them months to get around the world. So the idea of somebody managing to circumnavigate the globe in 80 days, it was huge. It made travel seem more possible and not affordable, but possible for a larger group of people than had been possible in human history before. So what Verne was writing about was a world that was changing in ways that the people that were reading him at the time couldn't even imagine or found it difficult to fathom. And of course, the film is so much fun. It invents that whole balloon sequence, which in the novel, I think it's dismissed as, you know, like a silly idea, but it's one of the most iconic scenes in Hollywood film. I enjoy the book and I enjoy the movie, and I would highly recommend it to anybody. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.